Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo, but with a slightly different situation, I hear.
Yes. I've hinted at this news now for a while because this has been in the works for almost 6 months. But I have officially hung up my independent spurs, I guess, and taken a position with a company called Symphony AI. I've talked about them in the past on the show a couple of times. So I have now taken on a role of VP of Innovation and Product Strategy in the Enterprise IT division. So very, very exciting. I'm super, it's sort of the culmination of my career of bringing sort of all the facets of my career up to this point together as an industry analyst, as an enterprise IT guy, and sort of bringing all that to bear to develop some very innovative, what I think anyway, are some very, very innovative solutions that are at the intersection of AI and workflow automation. And yeah, I'm sure it will come up in conversation on the show. It is important to know from a disclosure standpoint, why I'm really glad to be able to finally kind of put this out there. We sort of I say we compete with ServiceNow. We're obviously much smaller than ServiceNow. As a point of reference, Symphony AI is about a $500 million company, so we're obviously much smaller, but we do compete in some ways against ServiceNow. We certainly compete against companies like MoveWorks and um, Atomicwork, who we're going to be talking about today. Glean and a few others. And of course, a lot of the traditional ITSM players. So just, I don't want to have to disclose it every single time, but that's always sort of kind of keep that in the back of the mind that when we talk about it. But all that said, part of the reason I'm in this role is that I have both an enterprise IT mindset and an industry analyst mindset at heart, and I can't help myself. So I can't help but looking at things agnostically as well. So hopefully I will be able to walk that fine line. And
Yeah,
of
I
course, it's been
expect,
40 degrees here. So it's like in New York, so it's like spring is hinting, and I'm like, ah.
yes, I expect 100% that you will continue to be critical of all announcements as well as complimentary of things that happen well, regardless of whether they happen to a competitor or not. You see things in a fair and even way, and I will call you on it if something sounds too fluffy and too marketing-y.
Please do, please do. And you, of course, are traveling as well to a place that this whole shift represents something big for me. That you are at Zoho Day, which is Zoho's annual analyst conference that I have attended, I think, for the last 6 or 7 years. And honestly, I'm sitting here having the jitters because I'm not there with everyone this year with this sort of shift in role. So, yeah, it's kind of a wild time.
Yeah, kind of a full circle moment. This week in enterprise tech was kind of born at Zoho when we chatted at a
Right.
Zoho event a while ago, and look at what happened a year later.
Exactly. Well, with that, let's dive into the industry news.
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things that happened over the past week from a tech perspective, but we're going to start with some of the enterprise IT stalwarts. This was definitely has been a big week from an earnings perspective for some of the big companies in tech, such as IBM, SAP, ServiceNow. And we're going to dive into those just really quickly, each one. First of all, IBM, obviously a longtime stalwart in the IT space, has been making some noise recently around agentic AI, as well as getting some of its story around figuring out how to talk about tech enabled consulting and AI enabled consulting to a greater degree. And we're starting to see that the put change over to Arvind Krishna as CEO has really created some interesting results, and the market seems to like it so far.
Yeah, I think certainly positive. I've always been a fan of sorts, I guess, of IBM. I mean, certainly I have just any of us who sort of grew up in the IBM era, you just sort of, I always root for them to continue to find ways to be relevant. And they are a company that has a long history of reinvention. And I think this is another one of those stories. I think, we're going to talk about SAP here in a second. I think that they are largely in the category of SAP, that the bulk of their revenue is still being driven by the sort of legacy run rate business that is very difficult to unseat. And so that's a huge chunk of it. It is interesting to see them make some headway in AI. And you mentioned that Arvind Krishna is a huge part of that. I honestly have not been following IBM very carefully, and so when I was reading this article, it's like, oh gosh, I forgot I know him. I mean, not like I know him, but I've met with him and talked to him several times. And to your point, he is sharp as a tack, very technical, and I think that's exactly what IBM needs, particularly at this moment, because the thing we sometimes forget is AI is actually a very technical domain, and it's very complicated. And so you need to do that. I think IBM still has a lot of issues with their M&A strategy. They've got this disjointed collection of companies they've acquired and quasi rebranded. And I think they have all the building blocks to be a massive player. And I'm hopeful that this is a sign for them to sort of shift that, because I think they can have a lot of impact in the industry around it. But so this was really solid news for them.
Yes, one of the things that IBM has definitely struggled with in the past is getting a lot of great acquisitions, market-leading acquisitions that everybody would have said was a great idea from a pure synergy perspective, and then kind of making the messaging very mushy by turning everything into a broad-based data solution or a technology management solution in a way that loses some of the momentum and loses some of the nuance of having best-in-class acquisitions and technologies come into the IBM fold. So hopefully they will be able to maintain some of that nuance and some of that progress going forward with the acquisitions they're making, especially in the software space, and to keep letting Red Hat be Red Hat.
Yeah, that maybe is one of the big wins and I was actually very skeptical of that in the beginning, and it sort of turned into the tail that wags the dog. And so I think that's good. Talking about the other sort of big behemoth in this, because we'll talk about ServiceNow, but I think ServiceNow is in a different category here. SAP, another one of these companies, also like IBM and like Oracle and these guys, it's just a massive run rate business that sort of is the ship that you can't stop. But what we've been watching with all of these companies very carefully is, are they innovating? Are they figuring out how to not just have this sort of long, slow death, but actually finding a way to remain relevant? SAP in particular, I think, has struggled. I mean, when Bill McDermott was there was a lot of really solid momentum, but none of it really ever landed. It sounded great, and everyone sort of responded positively, but it never really landed. But their earnings report this year seems to show some signs that maybe finally it's the tide is shifting a little bit. I still struggle with seeing that they are actually like, we are not talking about them for the most part in the AI world or any of the things that are sort of occupying the mind. But I do think they are doing a good job of finding continued relevance within their core sweet spot, which for them, it's really about reducing churn, making sure that they aren't losing customers and pissing them off so much that they are willing to make a change. It doesn't hurt that there aren't a lot of options, but yeah, I mean, what was your take on the earnings report?
Yeah, I thought the most important part around SAP is that they are finally starting to make some headway in converting customers to the cloud and trying to figure out how to keep them in the fold from that perspective going forward, and to have them being simply have customers who are upgrading to the most recent version of SAP on an ongoing basis, rather than simply using their old 10-year-old highly customized version that they can never change or move from again. Because once you have that fixed version of your ERP, you can't modernize. You go down this hole of extremely customized support. You start looking at third-party support options, all these things that get you away from pure SAP and frankly, the revenue that comes along with having a loyal customer across the board. So it's interesting to see from that perspective. I agree that from a product perspective, it is hard to tell where SAP is best in breed at this point. That doesn't get emphasized as much because SAP is so focused on the big picture that, as I just said with IBM a little while ago, I think that is one of SAP's challenges, that if you want to be the solution for everything across the board in the company, you have to show how you are keeping up with everybody else. And there's a lot of competition right now in the SaaS world.
Yeah, but I think we're also seeing this momentum or this shift, I guess, in momentum where enterprises are focusing on these major platforms and they're
Mhm.
sort of consolidating their investments, and that is nothing but upside for SAP. And remember, SAP went through a whole bunch of leadership turmoil, and it doesn't seem to have had a major impact. So, good for them on that front.
Yes, much
The
like
other major financial,
Salesforce.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Well, I mean, I think it's you see these groups, they're all sort of in the same boat. Whereas, as long as they're not really screwing up, they're in really solid position.
mhm.
And trying to get into that same that illustrious group, I guess, of companies that sort of fall into that category of ServiceNow. They reported their earnings, which I think is fascinating because they beat expectations. They beat their what do you call it, their
Projections,
guidance. They
yeah,
beat their
guidance.
guidance. And yet the stock, because they didn't beat it by as much as people wanted them to, the stock still took a beating. I think it's rebounded now. It's just, I mean, this is a stock market thing, and it just speaks to the ridiculousness of it because if you look at their actual numbers, they're staggering. I mean, they've now grown. I mean, Bill McDermott has done an amazing job of truly accelerating the growth of a company that was already fairly large, but they're now looking at a run rate of about $12 billion. Um, and hitting massive numbers. I mean, the number in their summary here that was striking to me was nearly 500 customers with more than 5 million in ACV. Now, I did find it interesting they're saying ACV versus ARR, but regardless, that's still a massive number, and that
Right.
represents approximately 20% of their business coming from these super big organizations. And again, putting on the fact that bear in mind that we now compete with them on some degree, I think that's one of their weaknesses. If you are not a massive company, they're very clearly skewing to that sort of focus. But it's hard to argue with the performance. It is pretty remarkable.
Yes, and the fact that ServiceNow is continuing to expand its functional capabilities, which we're about to talk about. Most notably, ServiceNow has been making splashes over the past week about now being in CRM and being able to start handling enterprise application capabilities, whereas it has traditionally been seen as a workflow player. And this comes at a time when the CRM market is in a bit of flux because everything seems a little long in the tooth. There have definitely been some definitely been some progress made by companies like HubSpot getting into the CRM market and dealing with modern needs and use cases where the likes of Salesforce and Oracle and SAP aren't quite as excited to either innovate or make things simpler for the end user at this point.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. I'm actually curious. There's a lot of Zoho, where you're at the Zoho day. Zoho really cut its bones in terms of getting into as an enterprise player with their CRM product. So there's a lot of CRM analysts there. So I'll be really curious how some of the other folks that are there that you talk to, what their reaction is to some of this. But I do think it's interesting this. Uh, the ServiceNow announcements on two fronts, right? So they really had two big plays that sort of coincided with their earnings announcement. One was this sort of move, much more telegraphed move into the CRM space, and the other was their move into agentic AI workflows. And both of them, in my opinion, are aimed 100% at Salesforce. If you look at where Salesforce is at, if you look at ServiceNow's agentic AI solution, they are very clearly going after Agentforce. They are positioning this as a building platform, and I find it interesting on sort of both fronts. From the CRM standpoint, you talked about the fact that there's been this it's been this sort of stagnating market space, which is part of the reason that we've talked about Salesforce moving into the agentic AI motion. So it's really curious that ServiceNow decides to go after the CRM space. Now, it's a massive market, so maybe it's just simple dollars. They have to find sectors in which they can grow. But I found it quite interesting. And then the other little comment, and maybe this is now a competitive edge thing, but I watched the announcement, and like I'm a Bill McDermott fan, all right? I mean, I think that it's been amazing. But my exact takeaway when I watched their agentic AI announcement was, man, they were trying really hard, like way too hard to sell this. And I don't know if they feel they're behind Salesforce, which I guess they are because Salesforce has been in market, but a whopping 6 months. Um, so I don't know if they feel they're behind. I don't know what it was, but it felt different, right? I mean, I guess because if you think about ServiceNow historically in this space, they've always projected themselves as extremely competent and confident, right? They sort of didn't care what the rest of the world was doing, and this felt different. And I can't exactly tell you why, but it felt different.
Yeah, it is a challenge though because they're going into a very established space with where they are not leading the way. They are trying to provide some sort of guidance or direction that they have a new path, and that's always going to be a tough thing to do with an old market like CRM. But at the same time, there's definitely this space to improve the bridges between sales and marketing, the handoffs between campaigns and sales activity, as well as from a service perspective, the opportunity to automate a lot of this tier one support. We've been pretty honest in prior episodes about how AI will end up getting rid of the data entry type jobs and the FAQ, frequently asked question type questions that happen in the service world. If you are a tier one type help desk worker, that is a job that is absolutely going to be commoditized and automated soon enough by these platforms.
Yeah. Well, I do think it'll be interesting to see how that develops. It goes back. I talked about the fact that I had a conversation with the former CEO about the platform wars, and I will say personally, I'm gratified the fact that my prediction is 100% coming true. But who wins or how that plays out, I think we'll have to see. Other end of the spectrum, and another sort of competitor that we're looking at is a company called Atomicwork, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is they just secured their Series A funding of $25 million. They're specifically focusing sort of in the same space. Their focus is on basically applying agentic AI to IT service management. But here's the reason I wanted to bring it up. 25 million isn't a ton of money, and there's nothing that remarkable there. But I actually thought they were already funded. I mean, they have made a tremendous amount of noise in the market, and apparently without a whole lot of money behind it, and that's good for them. I'm actually quite impressed. I know several of the folks over there, and like I said, I think they've done an incredibly good job of actually getting a lot of market awareness. Apparently with just seed money. And so to me, that was what was notable about this. When I saw it, I was surprised because I thought they were far beyond Series A at this point.
And in theory, that's what venture capital is supposed to be, that you take a company that is very promising and has a cutting edge product and an unfair advantage, and you use the VC funding as rocket fuel to actually get that attention. So kudos to Atomicwork on actually standing out from an IT service perspective. From a bigger picture perspective, I'm excited about all the IT work that I struggled with early in my career finally possibly going away. Like when I did IT service management and IT asset management for a living back at Bose and at Teradyne, I always thought, why am I doing any of this work? This should all be automated. This should all have some sort of process automation in place. I tried to write as many scripts as I could personally to automate as much as I could, but I always knew there was room to do more. And now there's systematic solutions like Atomicwork, like I've heard Symphony, in this space that are able to actually help out. It's fantastic to see.
Yeah, what is fascinating, and not to make this focus on, but like I just reviewed an article that we're about to publish, and it was fascinating because the title was the future of employee support for 2030, and my response back internally was like, guys, we're doing this now. This isn't about 2030. We're doing this right now. And so I think it is remarkable how much is changing, and a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what Atomicwork and MoveWorks and a bunch of the players in the space, what we're all doing is actually what I wrote about in my first book a decade ago about what Nirvana looked like, about what employees actually expected, and we're finally on the cusp of, I think, delivering that, and it's actually super exciting. But all this AI is not without its risks, and we have reached a sort of an interesting point. As you may know, the EU tends to be on the forefront of regulation. In fact, was it that did you give me this? I just read a quote someplace that that when it comes to technology, the US innovates, the China duplicates, and the EU regulates, or something like that. Because that was a very kind of funny thing, but it's very true. And so the EU has some pretty interesting, or some regulations they put in place last year that are starting to come to bear. And so I think it's worth revisiting that.
Yes, the EUA Act, AI Act, which we have barely learned how to say because all those vowels get really messy, is starting to actually come into being from a practical perspective, with companies having to follow these rules, just like we had to figure out what the hell to do with GDPR. That even though we didn't love these rules, they were the prevailing rule of the land for the European Union and for anybody in Europe accessing these services. So just as we have put all these like, compliance issues into place for data protection, now we have to do the same thing for AI. And we have run into the February 2nd starting point for the EU AI being relevant from a banned AI systems perspective, meaning that we now are not supposed to use models that have an unacceptable risk for European Union residents. And there are a number of definitions used in the EU AI Act to define what these banned systems are, such as manipulating individuals and classifying individuals unfairly, and perhaps inferring race, sex, political opinions, things that are not that the model should not inherently know about you without additional inputs from your behalf. So, although it's not immediately enforceable, this is where we are supposed to start using these. And 6 months from now, there will start being potential punishments for companies that are not in compliance.
So I think there's three things that are sort of relevant here. First of all, if you're a CIO, you do need to be paying attention to this, because while most of this is targeted at the developers of AI, so the open AIs and the Microsofts, et cetera, there are provisions here that the deployers of that technology, meaning if you're a CIO, are also on the hook to a lesser degree, but you're on the hook for this. So that's sort of warning sign one. Warning sign two, you just talked about enforcement. The enforcement piece, as always, I've been fairly critical of some of the regulatory schemas, and that's mostly because it's so ill-defined. We you said may and all these hedges, and that's not about you. That's because we don't know. And so as a CIO, the thing that is always most risky is the uncertainty, and we really have no idea. Are they going to just put the hammer down? Is this a significant issue or not? They certainly have put in some big numbers, or at least potentially large numbers, particularly if you're not a massive company. But the third big risk is these banned AI systems definitions. If we're talking about a system that is designed explicitly to do these things, then yeah, duh, nobody, obviously that's bad. The hard part is we're talking about Gen AI here. And so a lot of these things about a system that manipulates individuals' decisions subliminally or deceptively, well, that can happen inadvertently in a lot of different ways. And if you go through all of these, and so I think there's a whole lot of ambiguity and a whole lot of potential risk factors here as a CIO. So your best friend is to focus on very targeted, strict use cases. As you're deploying this technology, it's going to keep you on much safer ground, certainly defensible ground. But yeah, I'll be watching this sort of with an open mind and a hopeful mind, but I think there's a bunch of risk here depending on how the EU decides to play this.
Yes, we joke a little bit about how perhaps models from, say, China might censor specific topics, and such as any criticism of their politics. That's just a Chinese cultural thing. But honestly, CIOs putting AI models into place that target or touch European customers are going to have to do similar types of things with certain topics to stay in compliance with the EU AI Act, and with up to 7% of revenues being potentially at risk, much like the 4% punishment for GDPR. This is meant to make it hurt if the EU goes after you.
Yeah, and I want to add one other thing. It's interesting, one of so Symphony AI, we're developing this agentic AI product, and so I've been talking to a lot of customers, and this question of guardrails has come up a few times, and my initial response was, again, we're mostly relying on much larger companies, like, we use the Microsoft Azure OpenAI LLM platform for the guardrails they have sort of baked in. But I was asked a really interesting question, which I think is relevant to any CIO. And that is, well, what about the opposite of those guardrails? And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, you have this guardrail in place, and maybe the guardrail is designed to protect PII. And what that means is now your AI system refuses to give a user information that they're actually entitled to, maybe address or whatever, because it's hitting up against this guardrail. And I think, much like we saw with GDPR, where it can actually create constraints and friction to doing very legitimate business, I think we have some risks there as well of the reverse guardrail, where it's overprotecting in areas where we have legitimate. So I think it's going to be an area that you have to be looking at very carefully. You have to figure out how to navigate it. And so you need to be paying attention, but we also need to be kind of taking a wait and see, because who knows?
Yep, absolutely. So
What we don't have to wait and see is the craziness that Elon Musk is creating in our U.S. government today. So I don't think we should spend too much time on this. The relevance to a CIO is just, especially if you do any business with a government, be on guard, I guess. But it's been kind of nuts. I don't know if you've been following this, right?
yeah, absolutely. I do find it wild that he is going into the Treasury system and Social Security data, basically with a small team of people, and he's been able to access whatever he wants. It doesn't seem like there's any government restrictions to what he can access. And I guess a couple of things that come to mind for me are, first, how easy it seems to be, that at the end of the day, the challenges of getting all of this data on American citizens and residents was really compliance based and based on having air gapped systems and the human basis of compliance. It wasn't a technical issue at all, at least not at first glance. I do wonder, and we're not getting this kind of detail, how challenging it is to work with these COBOL-based systems when the programmers and developers that Musk is working with seem to be pretty young. So I wish almost that, although I'm not a super big fan of what's happening, that I were a fly on the wall and being able to see how are they figuring out what's in there. Like, are they using generative AI and hoping to retro all the COBOL into something that they understand, or are they finding some way to get around that?
Well, I think the big issue is we don't understand what the end game is. We don't even understand what they're really trying to achieve. I mean, let's not forget. I mean, from an access standpoint, I think you're probably a little bit reacting harder than I am to it, mostly because, I mean, whether we agree with this or not, he is operating with the implicit approval of the president, which means theoretically they can do whatever they want from that regard. To me, what I'm really watching, we started talking a little bit about this with the Doge and the rebranding of the U.S. Digital Office. I think that's what it's called.
Mhm.
And to me the big issue is that he Musk is clearly following the playbook that he used at Twitter, where the resignation offers, or the, what is it called, the whatever, the offers that, if you resign your position you get the bonus and whatever. And the issue is on the one hand, it certainly had a positive impact in terms of reducing the bloat and cost of Twitter, but it also has resulted in them not making any money and losing a lot of relevance. And it's like, is that really the playbook we should be following here? And I think the stakes are so much higher. I mean, Twitter, while it was important, it was also just, a social media site. I mean, this is stuff that affects millions and millions of people in a very real way, and it's incredibly complex. The underlying components of what we're talking about, the underlying reason why there's all this complexity, um, there's a whole lot to it. And so this blunt force sort of approach that they both seem to be taking, um, scares me a bit. And I think it's, the big question again is, if I'm a CIO, what I'm looking at is how much uncertainty does this create? How much volatility does this generate in the market? And I think, if at the very least you should be, as you look at your strategic planning, how do you add additional risk factors here to try to give yourself some hedges? Because I think we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, my biggest concern is that, frankly, Musk and his team do not have the security clearances associated with the data that they are targeting. And if that was an assumption that you were making in working with the government, that assumption has to change, and any other compliance and governance issues that affect your company on a global basis have to change as a result as well. I do wonder a little bit as well. Elon has that PayPal background as well. Now, obviously, he understands what payments are, and Social Security and the $6 trillion in Treasury payments have to be an interesting target for him to potentially look at and try to modernize. So I wonder if we'll see anything around that in the
Yeah,
future.
I mean, I know I've read a couple of reports that are super nefarious that he's trying to stop payments to competitors and a bunch of other stuff. And I am for the moment giving him the benefit of the doubt that this is at least not this is at least a true, if misguided from my opinion, attempt to transform the government in some way, which, as we talked about last week, is necessary. There's a lot of reason to fix things. I'm certainly not sitting here and saying that there isn't stuff to be fixed. As someone who's done pretty significant project work within government agencies, I mean, there's some huge messes, but I still think we need a much more nuanced, deliberate approach rather than the sort of bull in the china shop kind of model that seems to be. But I guess we'll have to see how that plays out. Speaking of bull in a china shop, we talked a lot last week about DeepSeek and its disruptive elements in terms of upsetting the established sort of AI space. And I wanted to revisit a little bit today because after the hype settled, I think we got a little bit more introspective articles and analysis that really dove deeper into what really happened and what this represented. And it actually changed my mind a little bit about what this represented. And so we won't go through all of them. There's a total of 4 articles that I identified. One is actually a LinkedIn article by my new boss, Pratik Kathpal, talking. And this was actually one of the more, genuinely one of the more interesting articles because it dove really deep into the fact that one of the things that DeepSeek did was ditching CUDA, which is an NVIDIA's sort of framework for PTX, which is the sort of the assembly level language to actually reprogram the chips. And that sort of message was hit on in a number of other articles, one by VentureBeat that talked about how they're focused on reinforcement learning. The one of the co-founders at Anthropic had a slightly critical take looking at this and really started making the case that, hey, this was in fact a pretty real thing, and it was driven by the fact that we constrained them, but it's also something that when you look at it and abstract it away, again, as we talked about, really wasn't that unanticipated. The big surprise was it came out of China, not from Anthropic or OpenAI. And then the last one of the people that we are huge fans of, Ben Thompson, who has the Stratechery, I can never say the dang name right, did a whole FAQ on it, which dove really deep into all the stuff. And one of the things was this idea of the distillation, as well as that the real innovation was in V3, which preceded the release of R1, and sort of dove into it. So, I don't know if you had a chance to get through all of them, but the big takeaway was that there was some real innovation. It was really driven by the fact that these constraints did in fact work. And that was sort of the old saying, necessity is the mother of innovation, that it forced them to become much more efficient in how they approached it, which led to these breakthroughs. And that is truly notable. But on the other hand, it's still the fundamental economics, the fundamental march here is that we are still on the sort of pathway to the fact that this is probably good for the entire market, and maybe not as unexpected as all the hype sort of implied. So I know that's a whole lot, but I'm just curious what your take on reading through all those articles were.
Yeah, there's 3 things that really got my attention. That first, as you said before, the use of PTX as a lower level language to help support model development was really interesting because we have gotten into a mindset over the past 10 to 15 years that we can just code our way out of any situation, just add more code. If we look at enterprise applications, they're notoriously spaghetti code, unfriendly. and disgusting just from a proofreading and editing perspective. And the idea that you could have more elegant and more focused code to get around the storage issues of not having H800s in your data center, I think that's a great step forward for saying, hey, there's more than one way to get to these super complex models. So I'm excited about that because it means you have to be skilled at developing again, and that's a differentiator potentially again for you to be able to get around the multi-billion-dollar budgets that OpenAI has to be able to do something else. And we also saw that the $6 million number was a little bit overplayed, since that was just the final training number for the V3 model. The second thing that I thought was really interesting was that this improvement in training reflects a distillation of models. So the head start that these companies had in building these foundation models is gone now, because now that we can distill from these large models, that gap, that perceived moat that existed the past couple of years, it's the end of that. Honestly, I think that's what the easy takeaway there. And one of the little nuances that I thought was really interesting was how they were able to improve these models by moving from kind of floating point 16 or 32 bit to FP8, 8-bit parameter, basically shrinking all the parameters and getting rid of a little bit of detail at the edges, at the what they call the mantissa or the fraction, like the 0.123, 0.895, instead of having an 8-bit or whatever, they might have shrunk that down to 4 bits. And like little things like that lead to big picture efficiencies, both from a training and a deployment perspective. And we don't have to always make things more and more complicated at every single level to get to these high performing models at the end of the day. The fact that DeepSeek was able to show that we can still tweak all these little bits of the pieces of the puzzle to get to the high level model results, I think is an important finding, because it means that we can actually still optimize a whole lot of things that are in the devil in the details.
Yeah, so I'm gonna putting my CIO lens on this. What are my big takeaways? Well, to me, the big takeaway is that we are still wild, wild west. There's going to be a massive continuing battle, and it is a race to the bottom. We're not investment analysts. We're not looking at it from that perspective. But while I don't think this represents an existential threat to any of the players, Stratechery identified that Google is probably the big loser here, and I would agree with that assessment. But generally speaking, we're on a march to AI being infused into everything, and we're at the very, very early stages of all of this. There's still nothing but upside and runway for pretty much everybody. I think, though, the big takeaway, and this affects both the CIO as well as anyone who's in the AI space that isn't one of these big giant companies, is that what this says is you can sort of count on the fact that the ongoing cost of both model development and inference will continue to drop. So this is a really positive sign from an efficiency standpoint. That the big barrier that we were all sort of keeping our eyes on was the power consumption, the ability to build data centers fast enough, all of that stuff, and this hints to the fact that it's not even so much that these particular innovations, but the fact that these innovations exist, the possibility for these innovations exists. We don't just have to keep throwing more and more compute at this to make it work. And so those are really positive signs. And that means if I'm a CIO, those are some of the risk factors that this sort of suddenly started to mitigate a bit. It means I can start moving forward with some of these investments with some confidence that those prices are going to continue to drop, and it's going to be much more manageable to deliver this. Because frankly, I think, up until this happened, a lot of us were sort of scratching our head. It's like, are we ever going to get to this point? Because AI didn't operate at like the way cloud did, where increased usage actually decreased your cost. Mm-hmm. And this is the first sign of real sign that maybe it will in fact do that. And if that's true, then suddenly everything changes. So I think there's some really positive signs around it. And it also means model independence is your friend. You want to be developing approaches that allow you to pick the best model for your use case or at the moment, because we're going to see a lot of this back and forth.
Yep, absolutely. And so on a final note, so we already talked about the US government a little bit. It turns out they have some other news as well with a new administration. We see a new CIO in place. And this one got our attention because it was a kind of an interesting choice that they made there.
Oh, that is the understatement. And I actually had missed this. And I almost wish I had missed it. You send it over and it's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So basically there is a federal CIO position. Most people don't even know it exists. Um, and but the Trump administration has named a gentleman by the name of Greg Bashia, I guess, into this role. And the most notable thing, I mean, he has a reasonable career. It's not like he's like a nobody at all, but most notably, he's never been a CIO, and now he is arguably the CIO of the largest organization in the world, and it sort of makes very little sense on a lot of levels. It's you know, I have sort of mixed feelings about it. So the former CIO was a woman named Claire Marturana, I think how you say it. I had the opportunity to meet with her and talk with her a few years back. Sharp as a tack, had been around, CIO roles within the federal government all over the place. Exactly what you'd expect and what you would want in it. And so from that to this, you're like scratching your head. On the other hand, the federal CIO role is sort of a bully pulpit role. Every government agency, every federal agency has its own CIO. And within that, there's typically layers of CIOs deep. I mean, this is such a massive bureaucracy that there's no one person that controls all of it anyway. So this is really about overall direction and strategy. Um, but to me, that makes the stakes even higher. And this gentleman just doesn't really seem to have the chops for it. So I guess we'll see. But I mean, what was your reaction to it?
Yeah, I found it interesting that Barbachi's biggest experience seems to be doing security and investigations on behalf of Palantir, which we know has been doing some spook level, interesting, deep AI work on behalf of the government and the military for a while now. So I would think that he's probably going to be pretty good at digging into specific details and looking for some root cause analysis challenges, but I will be interested to see how he does from a management perspective, because as we all know, the federal departments and the federal government it's an ocean liner. And regardless of what happens from shrinking the government perspective, the federal government organization is so large that you have to be able to figure out how to guide that ocean liner with the 300 plus million people who live here and the $6 trillion of payments and business that happens every year. All of that stuff has to be managed in some way. So we'll see how that goes. I do expect that he'll be able to do some of the interesting forensic work that this current administration seems focused on.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of, I guess, what worries me, because that's not what the role, in my opinion anyway, really should be. This is about what we need. And this is where I think even, Claire, from the standpoint that, like, for instance, I didn't know she'd even elevated into the role, probably didn't do a great job with this, but she was at least more capable of it. I think the primary job of this role is to cast this vision out about what should that be, and maybe she did it internally, but at least publicly, right? Putting this out there about this is the role of IT. This is the challenge the CIOs, I think, have had across the board for the last 2 decades. It's like the CIO needs to be this very public role, carving a strategic vision of the future of how technology is a transformational agent for the organization, whatever organization it's a part of. And I'm really struggling to see how this gentleman's gonna be able to do that. But I guess, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and fingers crossed that he isn't just going to be using this as another way to weaponize the federal government. But I guess we'll see.
We'll see. And I think that's also a note for the CIO office in general, thinking about your own role in celebrating tech as part of your organization and showing how that we say digital transformation all the time, but really how that digital footprint and your management capabilities reflect the needs of the business. That's the job. And if you're not articulating it, nobody's going to be doing it for you, and you're not going to be coming off looking so great in the long run.
Well said. Exactly.
Yeah. And on that note, with a big change, all the big changes this week, thanks for joining me yet again. And thank you to everybody who joined us for this podcast or video, however you ended up listening or seeing this. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what we should be taking on for next week. As always, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.